Hello, my name's Zoe and I'm going to be talking about a project carried out by the RSPB in collaboration with BTO and UKCEH and commissioned by the Scottish Government. We all know that the expansion of offshore wind is important for reaching the Scottish Government's energy targets, but as offshore wind moves into new geographic areas, it might impact on different species. And this is the case for Scotland's nocturnal prosolariform seabirds, whose breeding colonies are mostly on islands off the northern and western coasts, where there's been little offshore renewable development to date, but where there are plans for development under the ScotWind round. And in this piece of work, our focus was primarily on the Manx shearwater European storm petrel and Leach's storm petrel, and I'll refer to these as the focal species, but we also covered northern Fulmar and sooty shearwater to a lesser degree. We conducted a review of the scientific and grey literature to determine the current state of knowledge around the potential impacts of offshore wind on these species, and to identify data sources that could feed into frameworks for assessing the risks, such as collision risk models. We built a library of more than 1,000 papers and reports and circulated a draft review to international experts in petrel and shearwater ecology and behaviour, seabird vision, the offshore wind industry and maritime lighting regulations. We then held 2 workshops to check for overlooked information, to identify knowledge gaps and priority risks and mitigation options, and to identify future research needs and their associated challenges. The final report and catalogue of data sources was published by the Scottish Government in December last year. The evidence needs that were highlighted as being most important for the 3 focal species were to improve understanding of biases in detectability of birds at sea, flight height and speed and their variation, avoidance behaviour, light attraction and foraging ranges from breeding colonies, and I'll speak a little bit about each of those now. There's a need for experimental assessment of potential biases in at-sea survey methods, including detectability, identification and DL variation. And detectability could be tested by carrying out targeted digital aerial surveys with an experimental approach, using either tagged model decoys or tagged free-roaming birds, although achieving adequate sample sizes would be challenging. Estimates of flight parameters such as speed and height can be gained from tracking data, but acquiring accurate estimates is difficult. Instantaneous flight speeds from GPS tags based on Doppler shift information, which comes from the movement of the tag relative to the movement of the satellites, will generally be more accurate than that derived from the distance covered between 2 fixes. Accurate height measurements tend to require additional sensors, and these make tags heavier. And given the small size of storm petrels, the range of tracking devices that we can currently deploy in them is very limited. Assessment of macro avoidance of wind farm developments can be achieved by comparing marine distributions of seabirds pre and post construction. And given the limited tracking of the 3 focal species in Scotland to date, we recommend further tracking studies from key colonies to better understand the pre-construction movements and distribution of these species. And these tracking studies should continue as construction occurs and after it's completed to inform our understanding of avoidance behaviour. There's currently a lack of evidence relating to light attraction in these species, and it's clear from the evidence base that all 3 focal species might become disorientated by powerful light. This typically occurs in foggy conditions and particularly affects recently fledged young who may still have underdeveloped visual capabilities. And in these circumstances, birds might circle a light source for many hours until succumbing to dehydration or exhaustion. And in the context of attraction to wind turbines, the probability of collision is vastly increased, since a bird might pass through the rotor-swept area many times. And attraction to or disorientation by light can also be considered a form of displacement, for example if birds are drawn away from foraging areas or natural behaviours. So we recommend urgent studies to quantify the distance over which flight paths of these species might be influenced by bright light sources, to examine the age class of individuals most likely to be affected, and to assess whether the wavelength and pattern of illumination, so whether a light is flashing or constant, might affect the level of attraction or disorientation. Current knowledge of foraging ranges and the locations and sizes of SPA colonies suggests that these features of Scottish SPAs listed here may be impacted by developments within ScotWind plan options. And while a small amount of tracking data exists for some species at some of these colonies, highlighted in bold, we recommend further work to establish ecological connectivity between plan options and these protected features. And it's important to note that given the long distance movements of these procelariforms, particularly during migration, there may also be connectivity between ScotWind plan options and colonies outside of Scotland, and as far away as Canada in the case of Leach's storm petrel. So tracking of these species from colonies elsewhere would be required to determine the extent of this overlap. Our report also details several options for mitigation of potential impacts, such as these listed here, and we discuss the current technical and legislative constraints to these sorts of modifications. So that's a brief overview of some key points, but the report goes into much more detail and is available from the Scottish Government website. I just want to say thank you to all the co-authors and to the many people who contributed to the project, either by attending workshops or commenting on drafts. Unfortunately, I'm not able to take questions today, but please feel free to drop me an email. Thank you.
Hello, I'm going to talk about some of the work that BTO have done recently in collaboration with the RSPB and others, reviewing the information that's available about species migratory routes and behaviour in order to better understand the potential risk posed by these species colliding with offshore wind farms. Collisions with turbine blades are seen as one of the key impacts of offshore wind farms on birds. Reflecting the implication of many of the existing projects, much of the research on this topic to date has focused on seabirds. However, as the number and size of offshore wind farms increases, the risk to migrating birds is likely to become greater. The development of floating turbines, which facilitates the building of projects in deeper water further offshore, may increase the relative importance of collision risk to migrant species. Our project had two key parts. The first of these, which I will cover in this talk, was to review the parameters and data available to assess collision risk to migrating birds. The outputs from this review will then feed into a tool which was developed in the second part of this project to estimate migrant collision risk, and Bruno is going to cover that tool in the next talk. We felt that migratory seabirds were better covered by existing tools and approaches. Consequently, for the purposes of this review, we focused on 17 non-seabird species features of UK SPAs. These included ducks, geese and swans, waders, raptors, as well as other species like nightjar and bittern. These include species and populations which either breed or winter in the UK, as well as those which are recorded on passage during the autumn or spring. As with seabirds, we can use collision risk models in order to estimate the number of migrating birds at risk of collision with offshore wind turbines. This requires an estimate of the total number of birds passing through UK waters, whether their final destination is in the UK or they are on passage between the breeding grounds and wintering grounds. We then need to know the proportion of those birds that pass through one or more wind farms and are at a height which places them at risk of collision and which fail to take any action to avoid that collision. Finally, we need to know the probability that a bird flying through a turbine rotor sweep will collide with the turbine blades. As you can imagine, understanding each of these elements requires a huge volume of information covering species population sizes, their migration routes and timing, as well as aspects of their flight behaviour such as height and speed. Furthermore, in summarising these data across all the species covered in our review, it became clear that there was a strong variation in both the quantity and quality of data available between both the species and the parameters we were interested in. We felt that it was important to capture this information in order to help highlight areas of greatest uncertainty for any subsequent assessments. Consequently, tried to make an assessment of our confidence in the values we identified. Our review covered data from a huge range of sources. In addition to peer-reviewed literature, reports and published estimates of species population sizes, We also reviewed tracking data, which offered information on species migration routes and timing, as well as on their flight heights and speeds. However, these data were only available for a minority of the species we were interested in. Consequently, we also reviewed other sources of data, such as ringing information, in order to provide information on migratory pathways, and bird track data to try and get an indication of the timing of key migratory movements. Having collated these data for all species, we assessed our confidence in the available information in order to make recommendations about suitable values to feed into the migration collision risk tool. As I previously highlighted, we found that the quality and quantity of data varied by species and parameter, with the highest quality data often available for larger bodied species like geese, swans and raptors, which can carry GPS tags generating valuable data on the routes, the heights and the speeds. For other species, especially the ducks and the smaller waders, we were far more reliant on other data types such as bird track and ringing recoveries, and consequently we were far less confident in the values that we identified for those species. A key question following our review was how confident we were that the migratory corridors identified using ringing data accurately reflected the routes taken by the birds on migration. Fortunately, there were a number of species for which we were also able to obtain GPS data, enabling us to make a comparison between the corridors estimated using ringing data and those recorded using GPS. These data suggested a reasonable degree of overlap. For example, for pink-footed geese on the left, both approaches identified a relatively narrow corridor within which the species migrates. In contrast, short-eared owls on the right are far more variable in movements, resulting in a much less clearly defined migratory corridor. This gave us confidence that, for species for which no GPS data were available, migratory corridors defined using ringing data were a reasonable representation of those actually used. So to summarise, we found that there was a marked variation in both the quantity and quality of data available for each species. Substantial uncertainties remain in relation to avoidance behaviour, flight heights, and even, in some cases, the population estimates for species. These uncertainties are likely to become more of an issue for migrating birds as the extent of development in the North Sea and elsewhere increases, and whilst the availability of smaller GPS tag will help fill gaps for some of these species, welfare considerations mean that there are limitations in relation to which species these can be used with. In such circumstances, we will either have to accept the greater uncertainty in our assessments or look to make use of alternative methodologies such as radar and MOTIS tracking in order to collect the data needed to reduce that uncertainty. Thank you for your attention, and thank you to the Scottish Government, Crown Estate Scotland and the Crown Estate for funding this work.
Hello everyone, my name is Bruno, and I'm going to talk about the latest developments in tools for stochastic collision risk models for seabirds. The other co-authors of this work were Grant Humphreys and Aonghais Cook. Collision risk models, sCRM for short, are used to estimate the likely number of collisions of birds with wind farms for a given period of time, could be monthly or per annum. And together with other effects such as displacements, they are used to evaluate potential impact of wind farm developments on bird populations. And they are a key requirement in environmental impact assessments for onshore or offshore wind farms in the UK since early 2000s. In terms of development of sCRM tools, the Inception tool was created in 2000 by Bill Band and co-authors. It laid down the basis and principles of sCRM as an impact assessment tool. It's commonly known as the Band sCRM and was implemented in Microsoft Excel. Then in 2015, the Band model was expanded to incorporate variability and uncertainty in parameters and to express that uncertainty in outputs. It was named a stochastic sCRM and it was implemented in R. Then in 2018, there was a development of an online tool for the stochastic sCRM, and the idea was to increase user accessibility. And finally, in 2021, there was work commissioned by Marine Scotland Science to further expand the sCRM tool for extra functionality, as well as to incorporate the assessment of collision risk for migration species. So zooming into the latest developments in the sCRM tool, it was beneficial to break down the task into 3 standalone tools. The base tool is called StockLab, and it's an R package responsible for running all the core computations involved with the stochastic sCRM. And then at the top we have 2 online GUIs. One is called mCRM and is tasked with running sCRM for migratory species, and the other one is the updated version of sCRM that includes the added functionality. In terms of workflow, the 2 GUIs collect user inputs and pass them on to StockLab. StockLab runs all the required computations and then take the outputs and feed them back to the GUIs where the results are displayed. The StockLab package, it is an adaptation of core calculation from previous CRM tools. The original code was refactored and restructured to improve performance and usability. The package offers a streamlined, well-documented CRM tool for our users, is easily distributed, and the code was structured in a way that will facilitate future expansions and integration with other tools. The tool has undergone review and testing and has been submitted and accepted to CRAN and rOpenSci. And here we have a quick look at the StockLab webpage, where there's an overview of the package, instructions of how to install and how to report bugs, as well as some instructions on how to run its functions with a couple of example code for a few applicable cases. In terms of the latest updates on the sCRM tool, added features include the ability to set multiple wind farm scenarios. There's an option for seasonal outputs. The user can choose between running the models in a stochastic or deterministic mode, and there was an attempt to create a cleaner user interface. Due to the improvements done in StockLab, simulations run much faster, which means that users have the possibility of running multiple turbine designs in one single run and have the results returned within a reasonable time. The beta version was released or has been released and is currently undergoing testing. So here we show a lightning quick demo of the sCRM app in action. As you can see, all the fields required for the wind farm scenarios. You can add as many wind farm scenarios as you would like as a user. Then within each wind farm, we need to select the species of interest and fill up all the required inputs. Here showing that, for instance, we can have or ask the outputs to be provided by season. Jumping into the next wind farm and the species that are of interest there. There are a number of default values for the most common species. We're not running that here because we will need to fill up all those fields in red, and we just want to show a very simple demo. Running here the model, so we have the results posted in either graphical or tabular form. I also mentioned that the option of running the models in the deterministic mode, and that switches off all the input fields with standard deviation values, and that's it. And finally, we focus on the main features of the mCRM app. It provides default inputs from a recent review of migratory bird species on Scottish waters, whose results I believe have been presented by Angus on an earlier talk. These default values include migration features, population abundances, and biological characteristics of 70 species. It also provides the app an extensive list of offshore wind farm footprints in the UK. The app starts by estimating the number of birds traveling through wind farms of interest, and then runs stochastic CRM calculations to assess the collision risk per migratory season. The beta version of the app has been released, and it's currently undergoing testing. Of course, I wouldn't leave you without a quick demo on the mCRM app. First, by showing how the user selects the wind farm footprints of interest that are plotted conveniently on the map. Then filling up the input for the wind farm features and turbine features. Next, the user selects the species of interest for which needs to be specified the migration parameters, such as migration seasons and migration corridors. Once that it's done, the user can generate the scenarios and also to calculate the number of flights through the wind farms of interest. And when that is ready, the stochastic simulations can be carried on so that we can get our collision risk assessment. And that's all we've got time for. Thank you for listening, and also thank you for the symposium organizers for the talk invitation. If you've got any question, please hold it tightly until the Q&A session, where I'll be more than happy to provide any necessary clarification. Cheers!
Hi, I'm Laura Jervis, one of the Associate Directors within the Marine Wildlife Survey team at APEM. We were contracted by the Scottish Government to fly a series of aerial surveys around operational wind farms using aircraft-mounted LiDAR. The surveys used high-resolution digital still imagery while simultaneously collecting light detection and ranging, or LiDAR data, to measure seabird flight heights. The context of the study was to provide data to further the knowledge of the behaviour of seabirds for the purposes of collision risk modelling. Collision risk modelling is a technique used to address the potential impact of an offshore wind farm on seabirds. One of the input parameters is species-specific proportion of flight heights within the rotor-swept area. Historically, bird flight heights were obtained using boat-based surveyors, and then following the advent of digital aerial survey methods, size-based calculations from aerial imagery. The limitations to these methods include bias in boat-based observations and lack of validation, low sample size, and larger confidence limits for size-based methods, which can lead to uncertainty. To address uncertainty, studies have combined multiple sources which negate issues around sample size and reduce random errors that may occur in results. For example, Johnson et al. 2014. Generic data do not allow for the influence of wind turbines to be investigated once operational, however. LiDAR technology uses laser light pulses to measure the position of an object in space, and in combination with aerial digital still imagery, provides highly accurate site-specific and species-specific flight heights of birds. The limitations of this method include the cost of the technology, and therefore a review is needed to understand how best to apply it for programs in the future. The aims of the project were to investigate the suitability for collecting robust avian flight height data, identify any potential methodological issues or challenges, examine whether seabird flight height differed between an area with wind turbine generators and a control area without wind turbine generators. 2 surveys were conducted around 3 offshore wind farms within the Moray Firth. The survey design was 2-kilometre spaced transects to deliver a minimum coverage of 10% of the survey area. Surveys were conducted at an altitude of 450 metres and at a speed of around 120 knots. Data collected were GPS linked. The ground sampling distance of the imagery was 2 centimetres, which allowed for a high level of identification of seabirds. A ground control site ensured high accuracy of the LiDAR point cloud data. LiDAR point cloud data was matched with birds from the imagery given a flight height for each individual, as well as a record of species, heading, age, size, and location. Raw counts of birds was used to analyse the difference in flight heights between the areas, and modelling was undertaken to investigate flight height with distance to turbine. Results showed that in Area 1, around the wind farms, overall birds flew significantly lower than those in the control Area 2. When the species were analysed separately, kittiwates and gannets flew significantly lower in Area 1 in comparison to Area 2, whereas for fulmars and large gulls there was no difference. Overall, there was a slight tendency for birds to fly lower when closer to the turbine. The maximum closeness to a turbine recorded was 44 metres and thereafter 189 metres. The limitations of the analysis were that the sample size of birds of interest within Area 1 was low, at 315 in total over the 2 surveys, and behaviour of different species may affect the models. Differences in bird behaviour should be considered for future analysis. Guillemots and herringulls tended to avoid turbines mostly 20 to 30 kilometres away. Razorbills were mostly distributed 625 metres to 15 kilometres away. Fulmars were recorded closer to turbines, generally with the minimum distance recorded at 189 metres. And for kittiwakes, gannets, the guillemot razorbill grouping and great skewers, there was no clear pattern detected. The match rates of LiDAR flight heights to individuals in the imagery was greater than 81% for all species groups with more than one count. It was possible to obtain a flight height for smaller size species such as puffin. The system was suitable for collecting species-specific flight heights over open water as well as within the operational wind farms. And the results showed that the system could be a tool to detect macro avoidance within and around wind farms for future studies. Avoidance of the area by seabirds leads to a lower number of individuals and therefore a lower overall risk of collision. It's difficult to assess impact of wind turbines on flight heights at this scale, and as such, planning of surveys with the assumption of reduced densities recorded during pre-construction is important. A larger sample size is needed, which would be achieved by studying areas with higher abundance or by increasing the number of surveys. To finish off, here is a video of a 3D fly-through model of the LiDAR point cloud data that was collected. You can see the blue points represent the sea surface where the LiDAR had a return, and the points above the sea surface represent individual seabirds in flight. So the green points are kittiwakes and the red points are gannets. And just underneath you can see the black outline of the survey boundary. Thank you for listening, and if you've got any questions, I'd be look forward to answering them.